we have our lecturer, Nadine Souto. Nadine became interested in sustainability while studying at UWC Mahindra College in 2006 to 2008. In college, she majored in sociology with a focus on sustainable development and participated in projects related to a variety of sustainability issues, including waste management, energy efficiency, clean water advocacy, and food security. In 2012, she co-founded sustainability website Comunumo and became involved with the Venezuelan UWC National Committee, where she now serves as executive director. So Nadine, please share your knowledge.
Sure. Thank you, Sid, for the introduction. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I work for UWC. I get to think about international education all day long, and then in my free time I do cool things like this. I was just telling the European section earlier about how it's really exciting for me and the entire UWC community to see these kinds of initiatives spring up from the alumni base. It's a way to bring the UWC educational model and the UWC spirit to a greater variety and diversity and number of students across the world. So it's really exciting, and I'm really happy to be able to be here first as a mentor and now as a lecturer to get to interact with more of you in this way. So as you know from the topic introduction and the sources that we sent along, today's lecture has to do with looking at the food system and some of the problems that are in it as in the way that we currently deal with food in our societies, and also envisioning some alternatives to the current system. So just to talk a little bit about what the structure of the lecture is going to be like. First, I'm going to start talking to you about what I think are some lessons that we can draw from the field of sociology. As Sid mentioned, that's what I focused on when I was in university, and I think that there are a few principles that we as change makers can take from the field to sort of aid us in our path. Second, I'm going to talk about some of the problems with the current food system. Then we're going to see some alternatives or some concepts that might help us envision a different food system that is better for people and the planet. I'm going to talk about one particular experience that I had while I was in the United States. And lastly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about what the assignment is that we have sort of come up with for you guys this week. So that is what the lecture is going to be like. Just a few maintenance issues. I'm going to be sharing my screen for most of the lecture. It's a presentation that has very little text. It's mostly just images, so you don't have to be looking at my face the whole time. But what that means is that I'm not going to be able to look at the Hangout, so I won't know if you guys are following me or if I'm having internet connection problems or anything. So if you could just once in a while, tell me that you're following me, and if anything comes up, please do jump in and let me know so that I can be aware of that. Okay, so let's start. So as I said, I'm coming from the field of sociology, and there are three lessons that I think that we can draw. One is that I want to challenge us to think about knowledge as situated as opposed to existing in a vacuum. What does this mean? Recently, some sociology authors have come to challenge this idea of objectivity, because they say, well, yes, there are some things that I need to do methodologically in order for my findings to be as unbiased as possible, but the knowledge that I produce is always going to be coming from a certain perspective, and it's going to be I view the world through a lens, and that lens is determined by who I am in society. What is my position? What is my historical position? What is my gender? What is my class? What is my race? And so I think that this is important for us as change makers to always be sort of aware of what it is that we're encountering, what is being presented to us as truth. And so yeah, question yourself, ask yourself, where is it that I'm coming from? And question that received knowledge, that sort of common sense that everybody around you believes. that is the first thing. The second thing that I want us to keep in mind is what is perhaps one of the main issues that sociologists are always thinking about, and that is the constant tension between individual agency, that is the ability of individuals to determine their life futures and have an impact on their surroundings, versus the constraints that social structures such as school, family, the media, culture, all these social structures are acting upon us and influencing us and our worldview from the very moment that we are born. So the question is about to what extent do we have a bearing on that? And it's not an easy question, and there's no determinism. That I think that the answer isn't being deterministic, but rather what I want you to take away from this is to know that the better you're able to understand and critically engage with these structures around you, the better you will be positioned to bring about these changes that we want to bring about. Okay, so I want to illustrate this with a cartoon, and here I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So if you could just let me know briefly when you can see the presentation. Can you see it? Hello. Okay. You can just turn on your microphone so that I can, once in a while, so that you can give me these sort of cues. Okay, so you guys can see the presentation. So here, we have a cartoon which I chose because I think that it's quite amusing, but it actually, I think, illustrates quite well what I was just talking about. And so we have these T-Rexes who are, oh, 1 second. Okay, you can still see me? Okay, I'm gonna put it on again. Something happened. Okay, we have the T-Rexes and the long-necked herbivore. So if you could just let me know if anything happens throughout the presentation, I would appreciate that. So the T-Rexes are, they have a strange attitude towards the herbivore. But why, though? The herbivore isn't, accusing or judging the T-Rexes for not making the same lifestyle choice that he made, assuming that, it's not an evolutionary mechanism at work here, but an actual, conscious choice to cease to eat meat. He's not trying to impose his lifestyle. He even brought his own food. So why would the T-Rexes be sort of mocking him or rejecting him in a way? And this has a lot to do with what I was just talking about. When an individual makes a conscious choice to in any way challenge the structures around him, he or she is gonna come up against resistance. Okay, and in this case, what is the herbivore challenging? Well, there are very important cultural, economic, and social structures that are actually supporting meat consumption. And it's a very natural, human nature thing that people would have a reaction to that. And if any of you are vegetarian, I'm sure that you have experienced this. People having, being questioning their choice or feeling like you're judging them when you're just making your own choices. So you might remember this quote from Gandhi, which was, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. Of course, he was talking about British colonialism, which is quite another thing. But I think that, when we're talking about these structures that hold up what we believe to be sort of common sense and the common way of doing things, I think that it works pretty similar. Let me just check that. Okay, good, you're still there. Sorry, I can't know if I'm just talking to myself. Okay, so that on the one hand. So because of this, because as an individual, when you try to make these changes, you're going to come up against resistance, right? And I bring this up because the next lesson that I want to talk about with sociology is about, creating system change versus individual change. So a lot of the talk around sustainability encourages all these very personal, individual lifestyle and mostly consumption choices. Okay, so we're constantly being told, eat organic, don't eat, the regular pesticide imbued stuff, or ride your bike versus drive. And these are important things. I'm not trying to sort of undermine the importance of making these individual choices. But the truth is that very often our ability or our willingness to make these sustainable lifestyle choices, so to speak, are contingent on factors that are beyond our control, and we may not even be aware of the extent to which these choices or the lack thereof are influenced by these structural factors. Okay, and I'm going to give you an example of this later on when I talk about the Bikisi Plenty project, and which was a food security project that I was involved with while I was at university, and so that I think illustrates this quite well. So while we're on the topic of choices, okay, so to sum up, basically these are the three things that I want you to take away from sociology, specifically this last idea about systems versus individual change. And sustainability nowadays is actually quite a mainstream concept, okay, to the extent that we even have big companies like Coca-Cola jumping on the sustainability bandwagon and sort of choosing to take on the green message as sort of a banner of their own. And this is not a bad thing per se, though I do think that it's important to back this marketing up with actual on the ground changes that support that. But what I'm trying to get at is that sustainability, talking about sustainability now doesn't raise eyebrows anymore. It's actually something that is pretty common to hear about and to talk about, and it's not necessarily going to come up against resistance. And this is quite different actually from maybe 50 years ago. To be precise, 1962, which was the year in which Rachel Carson published Silent Spring. This was a book that questioned and really challenged the use of pesticides, and so she presented a lot of evidence for the way pesticide use was having an impact on the environment. And this was something that was completely unquestioned until then. It was the status quo. It was the way of doing things. And this naturally came up against some resistance. In fact, Silent Spring is considered sort of the spark of the modern environmental movement in the U.S. So we've naturally come a long way from that, from the years of the first Earth Day and all that. So today, like I said, sustainability is no longer sort of as radical as it used to be. It's something that is actually quite mainstream now. But and that is a good thing. That is an opportunity for us to really take the advantage of the fact that it's not as questioned anymore, and transform that rhetoric into some real on the ground, sustainable and thorough change. Which is there's still a long way to go. We have our work cut out for us in that sense. Okay, you still with me? Yes, you're still with me. Okay, good. Sorry about that. I just want to make sure. Okay, so while we're talking about pesticides, I think this is a good segue into the issue of industrial agriculture, which I'm not going to go into too deeply because I know that you guys looked at the sources that I sent, which explains the issue much better than I did. But I do want to do a really quick overview. So one of the issues with industrial agriculture, as I mentioned, is monoculture. And here the idea is about having these huge operations for growing a single crop using industrial processes. So this is very large scale, and the use of resources is very intensive. So you have a lot of water, a lot of fossil fuels going in, as well as chemical inputs like pesticides and fertilizers. And obviously, such intensive resource use has a huge environmental impact, not just in terms of the greenhouse gas emissions, but also in terms of pollution of groundwater and water bodies, as well as, for example, pest resistance. The more that pests are exposed to these chemical agents that actually try to suppress them, what has happened actually is that more resistant and more resilient pests have come up that are less and less vulnerable to whatever sort of chemicals might be thrown its way. So this obviously creates a problem because we need to create more and more abrasive chemicals with the passing of time. And that shows also that the health impacts that are involved in consuming food that is grown in these circumstances. But also, you know, beyond that, in terms of the social and economic impact in the United States, for example, there are huge subsidies, government subsidies on certain crops. So, for example, corn has been subsidized to the extent that it is actually now artificially cheap in comparison with other foods. And what that has resulted in is that, for example, now you have a substance called high fructose corn syrup, which is, you know, a sweetener, kind of a substitute of sugar, just cheaper and more harmful actually. And it's everywhere. You know, it's pretty much anything that you will eat if you're in the United States. And this is so because of the industrial agricultural complex and the sort of economic and political decisions that support it. So that is monoculture. The other sort of practice that is involved with industrial agriculture has to do with meat production, specifically meat production in these areas called confined animal feeding operations, which again are these really large-scale, massive compounds which you know, are meant to process meat from the point of growing the animal, feeding it, slaughtering it. Okay, and again, this is very resource intensive, a lot of water, a lot of fossil fuels, but also antibiotics and hormones in order to be able to grow the animals as quickly as possible in these often unsanitary conditions. They need to be constantly injecting them with these medicines or hormones to allow them to prosper. So this is obviously, you know, has high environmental impacts once again, but also there are questions surrounding animal welfare here. These animals live their whole lives in these confined spaces. They are force-fed, high-calorie, grain-based diets, which their organisms are actually not cut out for. And then, you know, there have also been issues with regard to slaughtering practices, which are often inhumane. So that's the animal welfare is actually one of the main reasons for why people become vegetarian, because they aren't happy with the way that meat is dealt with in these kinds of operations. And finally, of course, the health issues involved with consuming meat that is produced in these circumstances. So that is just really quickly a summary of what you might have read about industrial agriculture. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this later, maybe in the questions if you have any doubts. As I mentioned, this is largely based on the United States, but of course these kinds of operations exist all over the world as well. Though they're not the only source of food, they're increasingly sort of the preferred mechanism. And there's a justification for that, of course. The issue of yield, you know, the issue that in order to feed a growing global population, you need to create these industrial processes. And of course, this is questionable, and then we see that the environmental impacts maybe are sufficient for us to consider other options, the environmental and social and health impacts. And so the question is, okay, so we have these mechanisms that you know have some questionable effects, but are we being fed well, you know? And here I want to check again that you are all with me. Okay, good. Yes, you are. Excellent. Uh, um, so I wanted to raise the question, okay, are we being fed well? And here I have a few headlines that I collected from different sources that deal with this issue. You know, so on the one hand, Mexico obesity bulges on diet concern. Over a period of 40 years, death from obesity has become more of a danger than death from malnutrition. Obesity, Africa's new crisis. Australian town weighed down by obesity declares war on fat. So we see here that increasingly, not only in developed countries, we know that the United States has been plagued by an obesity epidemic for years now, and this is something that is a great concern, has actually drawn policy initiatives to try and curb this. But it's no longer just the U.S. You know, we see also that developing countries are on the same route, and this has to do with a variety of issues, of course, but largely, I would say, with the food system that is supported on these sorts of based on these single crops that are, you know, very calorie heavy, but not necessarily healthy and nutritious. So that's the issue on the one hand. But then we also see, for example, the last two headlines that I have here: world hunger falls, but 805 million still chronically undernourished. So yeah, so hunger is going down, but it's still there. And then I want to pay special attention to this last one: hidden hunger. Global hunger index shows 2 billion malnourished worldwide. Okay, 2 billion malnourished, 800 million hungry, but many more malnourished. What does this mean? This means that hunger is one thing. Hunger means not getting enough calories. But you could very well be getting enough calories to subsist, but still not be well fed, still be malnourished. And if you look at the last sentence here related to this headline, not getting enough calories isn't the only way to starve. So we see here a bit of a shift in the way that we think about food and being fed. You know, it's no longer the question necessarily, you know, are we hungry, but are we food secure? And I'm going to be talking a little bit more about food security later. And next, the final sort of idea that I want to present with regard to the food system is this. 1/4 to 1/3 of all food produced for human consumption is lost or wasted. Okay, and this is huge. I mean, look at this: 1 billion metric tons of food wasted. And even if you look at the breakdown at the bottom, you see that in the U.S. and North America and Oceania, the amount of calories lost or wasted per person per day is 1,500, which amounts to pretty close to the recommended calorie intake per person per day of 2,000 calories. So essentially what this means is that it's a lot. so just to give a bit of an overview of the three issues that I've presented, we have on the one hand this very environmentally damaging system approach to creating food. Second, we have evidence that this system isn't feeding all of us well, and increasingly, because of food, we are facing illnesses like obesity and related diseases like heart disease and diabetes. And then third, we have all this waste that is left over of the system. So clearly something is amiss. You know, we have created this industrial monster, but it's not really getting us where we should be or where we would want to be. Okay? And I think here that at this point it's useful to introduce the concept of food security. Okay? It relates to what I was talking about earlier with regard to obesity and malnutrition. Food security, is a formal definition, is about having physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. Okay, so it's no longer, like I said earlier, about just being hungry. Of course, hunger is still an issue in many parts of the world, but we need to start thinking about it differently and think about food security and making sure that the calories that we are consuming are not only sufficient, but they're also good for us and allow us to lead a healthy life and develop to the best of our capacity. So that is, I think, a pretty useful concept to think about this. I might add to the concept of food security. It's not explicitly included in the definition, but many organizations that work around food security issues, I'm sure, would agree with including this in their approach about making sure that the processes involved in the production and distribution and processing of that food is also safe to the environment. Okay. So I would just add that to the food security definition when we're thinking about the concepts that we need to build a sturdier food system. You're still there, I'm guessing? Sit? Yes? Okay, I'm going to keep going. Hopefully you're still there. Okay, so the next part of the presentation, having given you an overview of first sort of some of the conceptual tools I think that we can take from sociology when thinking about these issues. Second, a bit of diagnosis of the food system and how much of it can be improved, actually. I want to talk about one particular experience that I had, specifically working with food security. Okay, and this was while I was studying in the United States, and particularly in a school called Vassar College, located in the town of Poughkeepsie, New York. This is a town of about 30,000 people. It's located roughly an hour and a half north of New York City. And essentially what happened was that a bunch of community organizations came together to form a coalition for food equality and food security. It was called Poughkeepsie Plenty. And why did they do this? Because they suspected, they knew that something was wrong with food in the city, that people weren't getting enough to eat, or that what they were eating wasn't doing them well. Okay, so we did a community food survey where people in Poughkeepsie were having a hard time getting to these supermarkets to get their food, because as I mentioned, they were located on highways, which meant that families needed access to a car. Public transportation systems were really very inadequate. They only ran in certain really inconvenient times. There was actually a limit on the number of grocery bags that you could bring on the bus. So imagine how ridiculous that is, that you would want to go shopping with your family to the supermarket and not be able to bring the bags onto the bus. So this was all happening. Meanwhile, in the inner city, so in the areas around Main Street, there were obviously food shops there as well. There were grocery stores as well as bodegas. I neglected to mention that Poughkeepsie has a very large migrant population from Central America, so there was a very vibrant Latino community. But it happened actually that these shops tended to have a way lower variety when it came to vegetables, for example, and the cost was higher. So while in the supermarkets in the suburbs you could get all sorts of vegetables in different price ranges, in the inner city shops you would get, for example, we found that in a certain range in the inner city you could only find shops that sold iceberg lettuce, which is actually the least nutritious of all the lettuces. So you found that people were actually having a hard time getting nutritious food, and this was a very big finding that didn't necessarily surprise anybody, but it was really a warning sign, because it showed to the extent to which the issue was systemic. We were talking earlier about individual versus system change, and we did awareness raising as part of the project, telling people, well, you need to eat more vegetables, and they'd be like, okay, sure, but if the system isn't allowing me to do that, there are structural forces acting upon me and my family and my community that inhibit those sorts of decisions. It's going to be so much harder. So that's why the answer is and was in this case systemic change. So with those results, we conducted some community food forums where the idea was about talking to people and actually thinking about solutions and approaches that would allow us to sort of build a sturdier food system in Poughkeepsie. And one of the initiatives that came out of this was a mobile farmers market. So, you know, there was already a farmers market in the city, but they made it, you know, beyond wheels. So the idea was a little bit, well, if people can't get to the supermarket will get to them. So this is just one example of one particular community experience with regard to food. And I do want to just really briefly talk about two other sort of campaigns or movements, really, to sort of transform what it is that we currently have as a food system that is clearly not working properly and leaving a lot of gaps. One of these is, you might have read in the sources, Meatless Monday. And, you know, this has been really popular. They've even gotten Paul McCartney on board to do some videos for them. So that's been, you know, I think it's friendly, you know. You have these cartoons. They're asking you not to eat them. It's cute. But again, it's mostly about awareness, and it's mostly about voluntary individual choice, which is important, but it's not sufficient, okay? Next, there's the example of community food gardens, and these are more of a systems approach, because, you know, it's about improving access. It's about having people be able to grow the food, the vegetables in their local community, engaging them in the process of creating that food and educating them, building community and creating useful public space. So of course these are small-scale operations, but it's not just anymore about consumption. It's also about production and citizen engagement. So I think that this is a really interesting sort of approach, and something that has had huge, you know, it's been really popular in many cities in the United States. So yeah, I think that just to sum up a little bit, perhaps the flaw in industrial agriculture is thinking that you can have sort of this one-size-fits-all solution to food, you know, to take these really large-scale industrial processes and apply them to food, whereas some of these alternatives are actually much more small-scale and more local and more about, you know, not having just a single solution, but plenty of solutions, because food eventually is so personal and so close to us that it makes sense that it should be in each of our communities as opposed to in some faraway land and then just have the food trucked over to us and we don't even know where it came from. So just to the last idea that I want to leave you with is this thought of how one of the issues with the current food system and one of the crises is about our disconnect from food, okay? And many of these alternatives and initiatives are actually about cultivating this closer relationship with food, where it comes from, how it's, you know, who makes it, how can we improve that, and how can we become involved. And, you know, with that, I think that we can talk to you about the assignment. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so you can see me again. Oops. Okay, so I've unshared my screen. There I am. Okay. So yeah, that's pretty much my presentation. The last thing I want to talk to you about is the assignment that we've come up with for you guys, and that essentially has to do with what I just told you last, which is about cultivating this closer relationship to food. So what we want you to do is to think about what you would eat, everything that you would eat on a single hypothetical day. Okay, and to gather all those items into a single place and take a picture. And next, you're going to think about what you know about these items. You know, do you know where this particular food item is bought? Even maybe your parents just buy it for you. You don't even know where it comes from. Do you know where it is produced? Is it close to home? Do you know the people involved in producing it? Even do you? And there are a bunch of things that you won't know, obviously. So what can you find out by asking your parents, asking your grocer, maybe even calling the number on the box to see where some of the processes that are involved in making this particular food item. And finally, just share your findings, especially with someone from the Europe region. We thought that might be an interesting way for you guys to interact and see how there might be differences between your experiences and what we can learn from those. So yeah, that's pretty much it in terms of my presentation. I'll be really interested to know what some of your questions and thoughts and comments are.
Thank you very much, Nadine, for your time and for sharing such knowledge with us. We really appreciate it, and I'm sure it's going to help us in the near future, and we'll be able to apply it in our daily life.